This series is dedicated to Jason, a follower and a member of the J Primecast community. I've already provided my answers to these questions in episode 1. Now it's time to hear from another creator that I admire and someone who also happens to be a member of the J Primecast community, Harold George.
Hi, my name is Harold George. I'm a comic artist. I've been doing this for quite some time now. Worked with some independent publishers here and there, mostly from New York City. I am from New York City as well. I live in California, and I've been cartooning and doing this for myself for a little bit longer than I've been working for other people. It's a really fun thing to do for me, and it keeps me busy. So I'm a graphic designer by day, creative director of magazines, marketing material for the company that I work for. Um, Outside of that, my hobby and side job is to work on comics, and I love to do comics. I love to create stories of my own, as well as work on other projects from other people. So I've worked on my own comic called The Show, and it was more of a collaboration with a couple of old school artists that I knew from back in New York. We just created these characters when we were young, and I kind of compilated them into one story. Someone else wrote the storyline for the first chapter, but I'm going to continue it as I move forward. But you can find that one online. I also do comic strip for another writer who's based off New Jersey, and that comic strip is called I Hate My Kids. It comes out every Wednesday, and it is in the webcomicfactory.com. I've done other books, one of which is Flesher and the Group, for another independent writer, again based from New York, and you can find those books in Amazon. Right now I'm working on a project called Ghost, the Core Chasers. And what it is, it's a story that I wrote a while back. I did all the writing for that one. I submitted it to a couple of my editor friends to check it out. So I'm ready to kind of get moving on that. I did a couple of pages way back before the show. Looking forward to getting that project started and finishing it like I did with the show. So that's why you probably should take me serious, or maybe not.
Writing your story in script form, is it important to write the entire thing out, including dialogue, before you tackle the art? Or do you put the dialogue in as you go, or maybe after all the art is done?
Writing a script, I found that writing a script is definitely beneficial for your story. A lot of the times in the beginning I used to try to do stuff as you go, but then I would get lost as far as where the story is going. Had no kind of point to it. So yeah, I definitely would write a script before anything.
I've been having difficulty naming my characters as well.
Naming characters. Most of the characters that I have right now have been named, and that happened over 20 years ago or so. And some of them have ridiculous names. Some of them just have to do with their powers. The idea, sometimes I get a name first and then I create the character based on the name. Sometimes it's the other way around. I don't really have a formula for it. It's just one of those whimsical things that happen. But I do put a lot of thought into the name as I'm creating it. But yeah, there's a lot of brainstorming, and then one day, boom, it catches. But like Justin mentioned, a lot of the times it doesn't really matter what your name is, as long as it's not something super campy. It doesn't matter what your name is. The way, or when you develop the character, as you're developing a character with the story plots, that character's name starts to bring life to the character, if that makes any sense. Or the name itself starts taking a whole different meaning.
And as far as your characters, do you develop them all before you even begin the book? Or do you develop them as you go? or some of them?
Character development for me uh, has a lot to do with the story plots. I do write a script, and I do try to keep to the character's main vein, if you may. Just trying to get their personalities correct. So a lot of the times as you're writing, as you're moving along with the story plots and the stories that you've created, your character kind of comes into sync. There's a lot of development that goes on based on some of the stuff that you put down on paper. Sometimes it's just happenstance, sometimes it's planned. How I develop the characters, it's through just the storytelling. If, for example, if something were to happen to, let's say, one of my characters in this case, and from the show, if, let's say, Spade gets hit by a rock or something in the head and he gets brain injury, so I can play with that. I can make that a part of the character's personality, or maybe a weakness, and things kind of like that. So it's all a matter of just telling a story and seeing where the character goes.
Transitioning from one place to another in the story.
Transitioning, what I do to allow the reader to know that I'm transitioning from one point to another, or one place to another, or another time, etc. I sometimes use color to tell the difference. I sometimes maybe use a different hue to that part of the story. I can do other styles. For instance, I can draw in a different completely style than the one that I'm using right now. I don't like to do that because then I get stuck in that. But you can also get another artist to, let's say, draw a flashback for you. Maybe just pencils on one instead of inks and color, So there's many different ways to transition a story. As far as if you want to keep the same style throughout, you can also use points of reference. For instance, if you zoom in on someone's eye, and as you're zooming out on the next page, which is another form of breaking the story, as you zoom out on the next page, it's somebody else's eye, and you can transition certain storytelling that way.
Flashbacks. What's the best way to illustrate a flashback? Just put it in a different color scheme, maybe grayscale, or is there something that I'm missing that indicates a flashback to let the reader know this is a flashback?
I haven't really illustrated a flashback, but if I did, I think one of the techniques would be to change the hue or the color.
Storyboard art. I understand what it is, just is it important? Do I need to do that, or not so much?
Storyboard art, do you need to do that as in before you do a comic? I don't think you do. I think thumbnails pretty much have the same effect, at least, unless you're filming something. I wouldn't be doing any storyboard art. I don't do any storyboard art before I jump into the comic. Mostly it's just thumbnails kind of guiding me with the script.
As far as drawing your comic out, do you prefer to draw on a bigger canvas size for more details and then shrink it down to size before putting it all into place, or do you just not really worry about fine details when it comes to comic art?
My progress when it comes, or my process when it comes to comic art has always been thumbnails at a small size, and then eventually I'll blow up that page, and then if I was doing it traditional, which I don't anymore, then I would use a tracing board or some sort, and kind of like etch in the figures and then go into detail. But now that I'm doing it digitally, I just go from thumbnail, and it's easy to blow things up on a computer.
Is there any relevance to the size of a panel?
On panel size, Yes, they do make a big difference. I do tend to vary some of the panels. Again, it all depends on personality of the character or what you want to emphasize on. The bigger the panel, of course, the more eyes are going to go to that panel. That's usually how I play it. You can get creative with panels, but for the most part, I tend to think that a lot of the times when you get too creative with panels, you kind of lose the reader. And I sometimes try to keep my panels somewhat straight or standard, unless I have somebody breaking off the panel, usually with some action.
Question: panel shape. Does that determine anything? How a story's read, etc., or is it just personal preference?
Panel shapes. Panel shapes, yes, they can be important. I try to keep a consistent panel shape throughout the book, whether it's rectangles or squares. Very seldom do I go a little like crazy with them, with weird shapes and stuff. I mean, it all depends on the artist. That's just my thing. Once in a while, maybe I'll throw in a circle or something. It all depends on your mood. If the story is told well, then it doesn't matter if there are any shapes to the panels. But again, I'd rather keep it simple so that I can understand it, and maybe later on I show a little more creativity and loosen up. But in the meantime, I'll try to keep them, as squares or rectangles, and sometimes cut a rectangle in half. But that's about it.
How fast do you want to tell your story? How do you decide, I'm going to break this up into a trilogy or a set that's larger, or I'm just going to tell it in one book and be done?
I'm a big fan of telling a long-winded story, if you may, and in this platform that we're using, I think it lends for that, so you can kind of keep going and going and going. I know anime has a tendency to have many chapters and different story arcs, which is awesome. So in that sense, I mimic that in my story plots, and so I don't really have an end to any particular storyline right now. Perhaps later on I will, but as of now, I don't even think of an ending.
Putting your book on an online platform for people to read for free, is that wise to do, or is it better to do once the book is complete?
Putting my comic up on my website, I did that as an experiment. It was my first comic, and I wanted to see how people reacted to it. In the beginning, it was more of an interactive comic where people would chime in, and we would determine together the plot. But then over the years, slowly, it just turned into my own thing where I wrote my own story, and I wanted people to see and kind of give me their feedback as to what they liked, what they didn't like. So that's why I kind of put the first episode up on there. Plus, it was one of my first comics that I've ever tried attempting to draw or to create.
So, Jason and anyone else who's listening, I hope that was helpful. Big thank you to Harold George of the show comic and I Hate My Kids. You can find his contact info in the description down below as long as you can see it. If you have a question, I would love to hear from you, and I mean that very literally. Send me an audio file through email at justinprime@yahoo.com, or if you have Anchor, you can easily send me a question through the app. Thank you so much for listening.